Hello, everyone, and thank you for coming tonight to our Oblong the Line event for The Ocean House, which is a new collection of stories by Mary-Beth Hughes, who is tonight in conversation with her fellow author, Debra Jo Immergut. My name is Leif Cantrell, and I am Oblong's Digital and Events Manager, and I will also be your tech host this evening. So before we begin, I just have a couple of housekeeping notes. I want to let you know that down at the bottom center of your screen, there is a Buy the book button. And so if you click on that, it will take you to signed copies of Mary-Beth's book, as well as copies of Debra Jo's books. There is also an Ask a Question button, which is kind of right below that Buy the Book button. So if at any point during the presentation you have a question for either of the authors, both of the authors, please feel more than free to enter a question. And in the last 10 or 15 minutes of tonight's event, I will be going through those questions and you will get your answers. So now it's my pleasure to introduce and talk a little bit about tonight's authors. Mary-Beth Hughes is the author of the best-selling novel Wavemaker II, a New York Times notable book, and the acclaimed collection Double Happiness, which earned a Pushcart Prize. Her book, The Loved Ones, was a New York Times editor's choice. Her stories have been published in The Paris Review, Plowshares, Georgia Review, and A Public Space. She lives in Brooklyn and in Rhinebeck, New York. Our host this evening is Debra Jo Immergut, who is the author of You Again and the Edgar-nominated novel The Captives and the story collection Private Property. She has been awarded a MacDowell Fellowship and a Missioner Fellowship. Her literary work has been published in American short fiction and narrative. As a journalist, she has been a frequent contributor to the Wall Street Journal and the Boston Globe. She is an MFA from the Iowa Writers Workshop. Debra Jo, I will now pass it over to you. Thank you both for joining us this evening.
Thank you, Leif, and thank you so much, Oblong Books. Are we good there? Okay. What a pleasure to be here tonight with Mary-Beth Hughes. I want to talk a little bit in an introductory way about our meeting. On the grounds of the MacDowell Colony in New Hampshire, where I met Mary-Beth in 2016, there is a beautiful small library. And in that library, there is a bookcase set aside to display the books of all the writers currently in residence. So on my first day of my first stay in MacDowell, I stood before this display feeling incredibly daunted. It had been a long time since I'd published anything, and I was there to try to see if I could find my way back. And I gravitated toward this one book. It had a very gorgeous cover that was ablaze in sort of pink and orange flames. Mm-hmm. And it was called The Loved Ones. I picked it up, I sat down with it, and after a few pages, I think I was changed by it. I was so stunned by the singular, intricate prose style, the fearless dark beauty of that story. And I thought, wow, I am going to have to work really, really hard while I'm here to even think about producing a novel that might sit on a shelf next to this one. And then very soon after that, I found myself sitting next to Mary-Beth at dinner, and I really could hardly speak to her. I was extremely intimidated thinking about her brilliant work. But then she flashed this dazzling smile my way, and she seemed so warm. And she turned out to be just that, dazzling and warm and very, very kind. So I was super thrilled to be asked by Mary-Beth to come help her tonight. While some write page turners, I think Mary-Beth writes what I'm going to call page lingerers. Works that demand and reward close attention, stories that direct the eye to the subtle details that surround life's most shocking turns. In life, those turns are likely to happen when we're not expecting them. And in Mary-Beth's work, they're likely to happen in the middle of a paragraph or in the middle of a sentence, or even, it seems, in the middle of the space between two words. It's really quite extraordinary, and for me, a bit inexplicable how she manages this. So I hope we'll get a few hints tonight. It's my great honor and great privilege to celebrate Mary-Beth and the Ocean House with you all and with Oblong Books. And with that, I'm going to throw a few questions your way, Mary-Beth.
Deborah, thank you so much. What an incredible introduction, really. What I remember about MacDowell actually is hearing the opening of this novel, You Again, the one that Oblong is excited about, along with all of your other work. So it was such a gift to hear that and to hear you read it. I was really wowed by it, and then later by our conversations, which have stayed so strong in my mind. I also feel like our books have come out sort of close enough together in this wild year that I thought, oh, what a great opportunity to be able to sort of come together with you and talk. So thank you for agreeing to do this.
Really my pleasure. All right, let's dive into this. So let's talk about the Jersey Shore. I want you to educate me and maybe a lot of people who are joining us here tonight. The culture of those towns that appear in your work, the meaning of those places for you, and how your main characters in the Ocean House, and let's start with Faith and Courtney, fit into that Jersey Shore landscape, which seems to be a different Jersey Shore from Bruce Springsteen's Jersey Shore.
Right. Although I think that Bruce Springsteen is sort of part of this particular area of the Jersey Shore, but you're right. This is a different town, let's say, than Asbury Park. So this area of New Jersey is Monmouth County for those of you who have sort of traveled in New Jersey, and it has a very particular feeling. It begins at the top of Sandy Hook in the north, which is a national park, and it's sort of a beautiful kind of peninsula, and then goes down just through Asbury Park, thank you, Bruce Springsteen, to through Spring Lake, which is very well known, and then sort of ends somewhere around Brielle or Manasquan. And it has a very particular quality because most of the towns are quite small, and they're sort of neighborhood towns, and they're sort of gathered around often these beach clubs. Beach clubs play a huge part in this area, and there are many of them. And so my interest in the Jersey Shore and this part of the Jersey Shore is because I grew up there, but only as a young person. So I left there when I was in 8th grade, and left the country, in fact, and lived other places. And by the time I came back 5 years later, I had changed fairly radically, and so had, I would say, the place. And so often the Jersey Shore I'm kind of invoking, especially with Faith and with Courtney, and their stories sort of begin. They're both born sort of in the late 50s. And so the first story with Courtney is set in the very early 60s. So I'm looking back at a period of time when the shore was a very different place. And even then it had already changed from something much grander earlier on. And so, it's really is a place that's sort of evolved again. I left there, I came back. For my mother, when we came back, I would say this was a homecoming, which is very important to me. I think she was very much a woman who felt this was her place in the world. But for me, I had already been jolted out of that world. So even when we came back, I began sort of traveling into New York to take classes. And then finally, pretty young, I just moved there altogether. But so for me, the Jersey Shore also is my mother in a certain way. It's her place. It's very much about that. And this book, I have to say, is all about mothers. I know something that we will sort of talk about later. So the time frame is long. It starts actually, World War II sort of is dropped in certain places, and then it sort of moves into the 21st century by the end of the book. We're in pretty familiar times. But there was the first story, I think, was really The Ocean House. was really impacted by Hurricane Sandy. So, this place that I knew very, very well, but mostly in memory and mostly as a place to think about my mother and to see my mother, was devastated, as were other places along the East Coast. And I had friends and I had family whose houses were wrecked, were ruined, and those people went on to rebuild. But a house that my mother had loved and spent tremendous time on was gutted and never rebuilt. And this happened after her death, so this was something she never saw, something I was really grateful for because it was so shocking, and it was a house that she had taken such great care of. So I think that first story, The Ocean House, really was inspired by that experience, hearing the experiences of my friends and family members. But it draws from that, even though it's set in a much earlier time. So.
Well, it is a gorgeous story, and it opens with a description of the house, which is so lovingly rendered and so detailed. I mean, you can feel the engraved, crabs and sea creatures in the window with these little girls tracing their fingers over the engraved glass, and you're just so brilliant at finding these small tactile details that really help us, ground ourselves in the story. And I feel like I had such a strong sense of that house, and I guess it's not giving away too much since you just said that the original house was destroyed. The destruction of that house in the story is incredibly tragic. And I think maybe we'll touch on it a little bit later. But I did not know that the Ocean House really was a real house in your life.
Right. So that particular house that I described is a different house, but the house, my mother's house, was very nearby, sort of in the same, and also right on the water. And the ocean met the rivers in this part of New Jersey when that hurricane happened, and it was quite something.
All right. Well, thank you. That helps me understand the geography a bit here. So you mentioned mothers and daughters. I felt as I was reading this story cycle that I was really almost like a very delicate, slow archaeological dig where we're picking out, we're subtly seeing remnants emerge, remnants of the choices of the women who've gone before us. In a way, there's many layers of mothers and daughters, their choices, the consequences, how they play out through the generations. And there's sort of a cyclical spiraling connection between many of the characters in the book, which is lovely and so moving. So I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about those layered mothers and daughters. I think you mentioned when we spoke a little while ago that writing this was at a key time in your life as mothers and daughters go.
Right. So yes, this is true. So I'll address sort of the broader question, sort of first about mothers and daughters. I think that all the stories, one way or another, seem to touch on this, and something that I really am interested in, and actually just saw again in somebody else's work that I've just read. I know we're going to talk about what we're reading at some point, but I want to say that I read Mark Wunderlich's new collection of poetry called The Gods of Nothingness. And he really touches on this essential quality of mothers. And he, in a couple of places in the poems are about many, many other things, but twice I was really sort of wowed by this certain quality where, he mentions, I'm going to talk about him and then I'm going to segue into talking about me. He mentions in one poem, the late, great poet Lucy Brock-Roydo. And in the poem says that she offered an essential mothering to a part of the speaker. And then in another poem, the memory of an actual mother sort of intervenes, at a very sort of crucial moment. And I think this sort of idea, both of people who are not necessarily an actual mother stepping in, and in the stories, this is not gender specific, men do this too, can step into a mothering role that's essential and that's needed at the right time. And this happens a few places in the stories. But then also that the sort of the presence of the mother, maybe not even in real time, and sort of what that does for a character. These are, things that I thought about again and again. I think the stories begin with young girls longing for a mother who is not yet lost, but is about to be. And there's someone steps into that role for them, sort of who might have offered an intervention, but that doesn't happen. It doesn't work out. And this is a tragedy, this is a tragic story. But the end story is about someone who, again, a little girl longing for a mother, but someone who is very unlikely to actually, by temperament, by orientation, to be able to do that, is, figures out a way to become a good mother, a good enough mother, as Winnicott, is often quoted as saying. And I find that like a wonderful, for me, that was very valuable trajectory, so yeah. And that happens several times in the stories, that sort of intervention.
Yes, the stories go to some dark places, but there are those heart opening moments, and that ending, the end of the final story is certainly one of those. And then your own mother
Right.
provided some inspiration, I think, or
She did. Yes. Well, no, I mean, in this sense, so I began the stories, the fragments of the stories, mostly about faith. I was at Yaddo, actually, in the summer of 2007. And so I had sort of a binder full of all these story parts, and certainly those beautiful windows. Yaddo is filled with sort of etched and famously stained glass Tiffany windows. And so, those windows, those fragile, beautiful windows come up, up here in this story. But while I was there, there was this sort of a sudden loss in sort of my writerly community. It had a big blasting effect, I would say, really. And so those stories sort of, in a funny way, sort of disappeared for a time. And I picked the first story about faith up again, maybe a year or so later, but I couldn't really find it in any real way. And then a year or two later, my mother died, and that's when I began sort of writing other parts to these other kinds of stories. And I noticed that the stories I was writing were all, the mothers were all gone or dead, or I was like, yikes, this is really tough. And then the Ocean House came after. So these were slow progression after Hurricane Sandy. I think sometime in that period, and I was thinking about this, especially since you and I chatted pretty recently, that Faith, who is, I think, the central figure in these stories, and Jean, who is the central figure in the loved ones, were almost like twins that, sort of identical twins separated at birth. So, so I couldn't reach these stories for a long time, but I could sort of look at Jean instead. So rather than going back to this material, I dealt Jean pretty much the same hand in a certain way. Mm-hmm. She's lost a child. Her husband is somewhat out of reach. But for Jean, the story happens over a year's time. And for a lot of reasons, Jean weights all of these things very differently. And the outcome is very different. And it's very sad, I would say. Really tragic. There's like a sort of a glimmer of possibility at the very end, but have to have high hopes that she grabs that, you know. So I began after the loved ones, and I'd been sort of noodling around with these stories. And while I, you know, at a certain point, I began noodling around with them again and saw them, you know, rather than one-offs, in relationship to one another. And looking at them, the ones that I had so far, I really began to sort of ask the question, you know, because Jean, not a lot could intervene for her, but I began to think what would make a difference? What really would make a difference? It was a real question, and it was a real guiding question around these stories. Where do people, what helps? What really sort of allows people to sort of find their way forward when things feel very, you know, kind of impossible? So it seemed like, yeah, so that was important to me. And I think it's answered a few times, I hope, in the stories. Yeah.
There's a real current of light that goes through the stories. And you know, it's sometimes quite buried. And then it emerges, and it's lovely. It's lovely to trace it, and you know, really, makes the reading experience very deep. So, a starred Kirkus review called The Ocean House, a Rube Goldberg-like collection of stories in which a single character from one tale trips a connection to another, a fascinating puzzle. So this is something in my own work that I have really come to enjoy in writing longer works, and that is the, you know, sort of dipping into that role of puzzle master. And I'm very curious about what you think about this, because I see you as a true evil genius in this regard, in the way you reveal very key bits of your characters' biographies very slowly, you know, sort of with an eyedropper, drop by drop, and often at moments when we're really not expecting to learn this, and so that it truly startles us. So I'm curious to know, you know, how do you decide, and how much thinking goes into when to reveal information in the set of stories, and maybe in your novels too, and how much or how little to give away, because you portion it out just right, but not one drop too much.
Right. I think that's a tricky question to answer, or I don't know if I know exactly how to answer it. I do know that I think of stories and novels very much in terms of shape, and in terms of rhythms and movement a lot. And I think I was really brought to thinking about stories in this way from studying with Merce Cunningham in New York City in his studio, sort of, so with many dancers, but he was very present at the time that I was there. And something, I'm not the only person to observe this. I mean, about Merce Cunningham's work, one of his wonderful dancers, Neil Greenberg, has sort of said this too, but it really intrigued me that, you know, Merce Cunningham was very serious about not imposing a narrative on top of a dance. You know, he had come out of Martha Graham, who was, you know, sort of illustrating the myths and, you know, sort of stories, but he didn't want that. He wanted the dances to be themselves. And but some of us watched these dances in motion or in parts of them and saw narrative, you know, saw stories like just unfolding before our eyes. I mean, these people sort of coming together and coming apart, you know, these were stories, and, you know, sort of the rhythm at which they did it, or, you know, how obliquely or how directly, all of that was stories. And I think, you know, through many, many years of sort of being, you know, sort of on the outer circle, very outer circle of his studio, you know, sort of going the wrong direction, but being sort of immersed in that, you know, sort of trained me in a certain way to think about narrative the way I saw it appear in his dances. So I don't know that I think about how much information I am putting in place, but I very much think about those shapes and rhythms and, you know, sequences and things like that, all of which I learned, I think, in that studio. Yeah.
So would you I mean, would you agree about that description of this story cycle as a bit of a puzzle, or it sounds like it just sort of that was the shape that it took for you?
Well, I do think it was a bit. Actually, I do think it was a puzzle, because the way I think of them is that they're sort of a cat's cradle, like all the stories together. Like they really sort of, one line could be very light and sort of connect as sort of an unexpected part of a different story. So cat's cradles are indeed puzzles, so yes, I did think of them that way. Yeah. And
it's
I love
one of the pleasures of reading this book is unraveling that cat's cradle, to the extent that we can. And then there's, it retains a lot of mystery as well, which of course I love. Another thing that really struck me with this work, I think I've seen it in your others too, but you have an incredibly fluid way of shifting points of view. From it can happen from one paragraph to the next, and maybe sometimes even in the middle of a paragraph, we might find ourselves looking out a different pair of eyes. We see through the eyes of a 5-year-old child and his preschool teacher, and we're just moving and flowing really in and out of these human beings. There's some, there's one story that's narrated by a group of poets. Or from their point of view, really. So tell me a little bit about how that occurred, how much thinking goes into it. Does it feel very natural when you're writing?
I think it feels pretty natural. I feel like usually when I'm writing, I'm sort of pretty close to who is sort of perceiving the action on the page. I think of it that way. The story one of the stories you referred to, Summer Space, has a little boy, Clarence, who is a very smart sort of observer of his world. I mean, I think he's very, very shrewd about what's happening around him, in fairly sharp contrast to the central figure in the story, who is Cece. So I think that Clarence has a lot to offer, in sort of laying out this tale. So it might be something like that.
Do you ever hesitate to invade the mind of a character? I mean, is there anywhere where you have drawn a line? Does that ever intimidate you in any way?
No, I think not. I think this is a sort of an odd thing to say, but when I had a neighbor who I've actually used her last name when I was a little girl, her last name was Ruddy, and I really was crazy about her, and we would chat. And she said to me when I was quite young, she thought that I had a problem in that, she thought I loved, I sort of looked at people with love, and she thought I should be a little bit shrewder. And this was advice to like a 4-year-old or something, she really thought, but I think that, I do think that I mean, I don't think of it that way. I'm sort of looking at these people with love, but I think I'm very unlikely to treat my characters harshly, even when they're acting badly. I mean, you and I sort of discussed that, all the super bad actors in the end up sort of actually quite just fine. They're really doing really well, in many ways. So, I'm not as I don't think I'm a sardonic writer, or I'm not sure what the correct word is. But so no, I never think I'm going to sort of harm a character by paying close attention to them. Which I think is where I would draw a line if I thought I was going to sort of, I don't know. Is that a sensible answer?
Absolutely. And I find your boldness so admirable and inspiring. So this is a little bit more about your world as a writer. I remember we talked a few years ago, and you told me just a tiny bit about a writing group that you were in, and that you've been sharing some work. And and I know that you have a very long-standing and fruitful relationship with your editor Elizabeth Schmitz
Yes.
of Atlantic. And so I'm curious if you could talk about a little bit about drafts. When you share, are you very secretive about them? And maybe a little bit about your collaboration with your editor.
Sure. So I do. Yes. My writing group has been meeting for a very long time. We don't meet often, but we do get together, and then there are these kind of lavish, fantastic dinners, which I think are pretty great. But when we meet, all we do is read to one another. So it's just we don't change work. I think that might happen privately, but for me, it doesn't happen. I don't give, I don't ask people to read my manuscripts. That happens with Elizabeth Schmitz, and I would say that my attitude toward her is, maybe worshipful. Is she's really quite something. I think she's a marvelous editor, and I know I share that opinion with other writers that have worked with her, either are new to her or have worked with her for a long time. I think she's a very intuitive editor, and really is very, very generous, sort of with both her heart and her, superb mind, so she gives quite a lot, but she also gives a lot of space. So like her approach is very, she'll drop a hint or she'll point something in direction. I mean, manuscripts she treats with great tenderness and care and does not mark them up quite heavily. So this is something that she's sort of an approach that I'm very used to, and that she established, now quite a while ago with me. This particular book also had the editorial eye of a new assistant editor, Yvonne Cha. And I have to say, I am so grateful to her too. She has a very different approach. She's very direct. She makes lots of suggestions. And when I first received her feedback, I was stunned. I think that, I was really so surprised. But then because I hadn't had this kind of an editorial relationship before, but it was so helpful. I mean, it was so helpful because it was so challenging. I believe she thinks about fiction very differently than I do, which is great. It was just, once I got over the surprise, I really valued it. It was just helpful to see the book through these eyes. But I really cherish my relationship with Elizabeth. I think she's an extraordinary editor moving through the literary world.
Well, I'm very grateful that she has granted you so much space and your work space, because I wouldn't want to tinker with it too much. Although, it is wonderful to have a very astute reader. Like it sounds like Yvonne is, to tighten up here and there where you need it and clarify here and there. But I love the spaciousness of your work, and I am grateful that you've been allowed that. So I want to quote a little bit from a New York Times book review. Tom Beller, he wrote that your prose is elusive, artful, intriguing, and infuriating. And, I think that must be okay with you, because I saw that on your website. So I figured it's okay then if you put it up there to point out that he called your work infuriating. And as I said in my intro, it asks a lot of the reader, but it rewards every bit of effort that it requires. On the sentence level, your voice is so finely honed. It's such an instrument, a remarkable instrument. And I know this is very difficult for a writer to speak to and articulate about, but can you give us any insight into either your mechanics or perhaps early inspirations as you were developing that very distinctive voice of yours, And you know, if you have any techniques or tricks that you use, you know, to polish those sentences, they're so beautiful.
Oh, thank you. I was lucky that I grew up in a household of readers. You know, both my parents were like, loved to read. It was sort of part of what they did. So I was an early reader and loved to read. And I remember, I mean, reading, I have to say, I think I have this sort of, you know, almost like a physical memory of reading Eudora Welty as sort of a very young teenager. I think she's, you know, an extraordinary writer. And I think she brought that sort of deep gaze. And, you know, as you were saying, you know, she wrote about many different kinds of people and was also a photographer. And, you know, so that sort of desire to look very, very carefully. Much later in my life, I was sort of overwhelmed by the power of Penelope Fitzgerald. I mean, I thought, wow, this is what an extraordinary writer, and you know, also a great, you know, exquisite sentence writer. And I think that, you know, for me, I think for writing sentences or writing at all is very, you know, I mean, I listen a lot. I love to hear people read aloud, actually. And I especially loved hearing you at MacDowell. And so it's something I do a lot of, and I listen to very recently. I mean, in our pandemic, you know, sort of books on tape when we're you know, when in the middle of the night, I have to say, is, you know, when I'm wide awake and worrying about the world, you know, they've been sort of lifesavers. I listened to Hilma Wolitzer, extraordinary novelist, very recently, listened to her work, The Doctor's Daughter. But I want to recommend, before you leap there, and it's beautiful, and I do recommend it, is to listen to her daughter, Meg Wolitzer, recorded a reading of Hilma Wolitzer's stories, Sundays. And she recorded this on Mother's Day through the 92nd Street Y, and I think it's easily available, and it is so beautiful. The story is sexy and funny and brilliant, and the sentences are exquisite. And Meg Wolitzer does this just, you know, breathtaking job of reading the story. So it's really, really great. So I like the sound of the way, and that's probably where I go to in making sentences.
All right. Well, thank you for that middle of the night recommendation. As I am doing that also, and it helps.
Yes.
And I think we need that right now.
Mm-hmm.
You know, there are some common themes as I think, you know, think over. I think I've read everything that you've written, and I see a lot of subtle threads that run between them. I'm wondering if, you know, if this is, you know, these common themes have sort of emerged organically. Do you, are you even aware of them as you go? You know, you mentioned earlier that you saw Jean and Faith almost as twin sisters. And I see some definite overlap there. Is that something that you spend time sort of contemplating as you look back on your work now as as someone with quite a nice shelf of books at this point?
If I do, maybe it's to say, oh, not again. But I do hear this in other writers too, and I think it's something I've heard other writers speak about, that they sort of seem to sort of look at similar things again and again from different angles. So once again, I did Meg Wolitzer. Once again, I heard her in conversation with Marion Taves, and the question came up, you know, about recurring themes, and Meg Wolitzer suggested, oh, maybe, you know, most writers look at 2 or 3, you know, sort of things over a lifetime of writing, and Miriam Taves, I think, answered maybe only one. So
very comforting to hear, because I'm wrestling with this right now. That, oh, not again.
right.
Yeah. So I think we just need to give ourselves over to that then, and these are the great questions of our lives, and we're going to explore them. I think that's where we'll settle on that one. Okay, I think unless you have more reading recommendations for us, and I have one for everyone, which is your work, and particularly we didn't talk much about Wavemaker II, but I think that might be my favorite, although I really loved the loved ones too. And then there's this one, which is gorgeous. So is there anyone else that's on your nightstand right now that we ought to know about before we throw it out to our audience? Question.
I do want to recommend Peter Cameron's most recent novel, What Happens at Night. I read it this summer when it came out, sort of around the same time that your book came out, and I read it in a hurricane, and the lights, our electricity went out, so I barely skipped a beat and found a flashlight and read the book to the end in the dark by flashlight. I mean, it was that kind of riveting. It's a really exquisite book. I think one that you actually would love, Deborah. I think he's very much a kindred spirit with you. You're both like really gripping and sort of know how to do that. So and I think this is a literary thriller, which is why I'm going to throw it out there, like yours.
Okay, well, I've never read his work, but Penelope Fitzgerald I have read everything by more than once. So I love to hear that she's an inspiration for you too, and she's such a master of the short novel. I really admire that and aspire to that too. The concision, I see it in your work as well. Okay, well, I think Leif, if you can hear me, I'm sure we have questions from this lively group that's gathered tonight.
Yes, thank you both so much. That was such a thoughtful and engaging conversation. It was so lovely to listen to. I so appreciate it. So our first question is from Kendall, and I believe this question would be great for both of you to answer, and it's, what made you want to write a book?
Deborah, please.
Reading books. I mean, going back to my youngest days, I was a voracious reader, and for many years I didn't think that I could even dream of writing a book. But eventually, when I was in my early 20s, I thought, I tried some other careers and trying to get serious about, career paths. And basically I thought, no, I wonder if I could actually be a writer. And I ended up, then I found out there was this thing called an MFA program, and that would help me, perhaps give me some reason, some purpose. And then I learned you can actually be a writer if if you're willing to take some twists and turns in your life. Mary-Beth?
Oh, yes. Yeah, I think I don't know if I ever had sort of a moment where I understood I wanted to be a writer. I think I started sort of writing in my teens, but I actually didn't start publishing until I was close to 40 or 40. So, I was not only a late bloomer, I sort of I think there's another word for the lag time, but I think for many years I was writing stories. I loved them. I loved to read. I loved so eventually over time I was writing stories, and then a novel, and then more stories, novels.
It sounds like it just kind of evolved naturally for you. Like it just, would you say that?
Yes, I would actually. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
That's lovely. So our next question is from Carla, who asks, no pressure, but Mary-Beth, have you started your next book? And I know sometimes you can't talk about these things because of contracts and whatnot, but if you can.
Thank you, Carla. I'm once again sort of doing what I seem to always do, is just sort of picking up bits and pieces, trying to write things, and sort of eventually, I think I'll find a sort of, some of those things will consolidate around a sort of a narrative that, I'll take forward. I'm somebody who writes a great deal and publishes very little compared to sort of sort of the reams of paper I have sort of, and, digital files I have floating around, so I try different things for a long time before I begin to sort of find
a method. Yeah.
Exactly. So Carla, the answer is I don't know yet.
When it evolves so organically, like you're describing, I imagine it's not like, oh, I'm writing a book today. It's
exactly.
it just blooms like a garden. So thank you for sharing that. I have a couple questions for you all while I think everyone gathers their thoughts. And so to our audience members out there, if you have any other thoughts or questions, please feel free to put them in the Ask a Question button. But in the meantime, I have a question for both of you, which is, what do you do when you need literary inspiration or when you just feel stuck with writing? What is kind of your go-to habits and tips and tricks?
All right, Mary-Beth, I'll give you a minute. Again, I'm going to say the obvious answer, which is reading. I will pick up, I love to read poetry to get my brain warmed up in the morning. So I will often just pick up a book of poetry at random, really, and sort of swim around in words for a bit. And I think I tend to not, I don't read a ton of current fiction, but I dip way back into, I love to read Victorian novels and try to figure out the tricks that they have used and early 20th century. So I tend to do a lot of rereading and really studying some of my favorites, some of those classics who, that inspired me, from my earliest days. But, I will always turn back to, The Great Gatsby, for example, when I'm thinking about problems of narration and point of view. And of course, just to taste that language and, it's very much like the effect that Mary-Beth's work had the first time I read it. You want something to reach for. And that is, that gets me going when I see greatness. So I try to keep a lot of that close by.
Thank you. That was such a great answer.
It was a great answer. I think that's such a good answer. Let's let it stand.
Okay, that's totally fair. We have some more questions to get to, so I want to give everyone time. Our next question.
Another question too, which I just noticed that I didn't ask, and I'm very curious about. So when we have a moment, go ahead.
Absolutely. Do you want to go ahead and ask that?
I wanted to ask about the concept of the story cycle, and when that came to you, how it is different in your mind from a collection, and was it ever going to be a novel?
It was not going to be a novel, no. And there was this sense in me that the stories would benefit from one another. I only sent out 2 of the stories as standalones, but that was quite early on before I understood that they really needed to be actually completed in relationship to one another. So as the stories sort of gathered, they really did sort of speak to, at least from my perspective, sort of speak to one another, So that's why they're sort of a cycle and, not a collection, I guess.
Okay. Interesting.
So our next question is from Kirk, who wants to know, could you talk about your writing practice, how it's changed or stayed the same during the pandemic?
I think that's a good question, Kirk. I'll speak to that, and then Deborah, if you want to weigh in too, that would be great. I suspect this is the great Kirk Walsh, who has written recently some very beautiful essays that have appeared, one in the New York Times Book Review and one at Lit Hub. She sort of is speaking, at least as for me as her reader, to something that I think is quite important about being a writer, being maybe any kind of artist. And this is sort of this idea of endurance. You know, it's sort of like just continuing and sort of continuing in the circumstances we're dealt. I want to say that Kirk, before I answer Kirk's question, she also has a quite fantastic novel coming out in April, The Elephant of Belfast. So, you know, we have something, you know, something to see as it comes into the world. So I feel like, you know, this what a challenge this time has been for all of us in so many ways. And you know, I've really tried to you know, keep a fairly steady practice. You know, which for me sometimes could be just, you know, sort of, you know, like just writing out a little tiny scene or, you know, sort of gathering a few thoughts and ideas around something, or sort of even adding on to something that's already there. I've also done some teaching, and I feel like that's been really valuable to me in this time period. I've taught a class that I'm actually about to sort of do a variation on again at a public space academy, which is just, for those of you who don't know it, it's really just, you know, a marvelous place and marvelous resource, also a great literary magazine. And I taught right at the beginning of the pandemic. I taught a class on Zoom, and you know, we just sort of all of us couldn't believe week after week what was happening. And so part of that class was about creating a practice that we could all walk into, you know, one way or another. And I did something like that again for undergrads this fall at Skidmore College. And Skidmore College is, you know, I was a guest, so, you know, I sort of went in cold, but I understand, because it's presented, that part of their ethos is that creative thought matters. Doesn't matter if you're pre-med or you're a climate Scientologist. I had both in my class, and, you know, and then I had some kids that were, you know, I hope declare themselves as writers very, very soon, you know, but it was I had such respect for them. I mean, they were incredible. They kind of came again week after week when the world was really tough. And I think it sort of gave us all something, you know, to sort of both be doing it ourselves and to be seeing each other in that way.
Thank you for sharing. That was beautiful.
I just want to say that I also know Kirk.
Oh,
A little bit
okay.
From Austin connections, and I heard a little bit about her forthcoming novel, and I'm very excited about it. So go, Kirk.
Yes. Well, I've read it.
I'm
reasonably excited. I've read it in galleries. So yes, it's really beautiful.
So the questions are flooding in now. So the next one is, which of the books you've written is your favorite and why? So I'll be very curious to hear if either of you, if you have favorites of the books you've written.
Debra?
Well, I hope that I will always say my latest book is my favorite. And I would say right now that, you know, You Again is a very personal story, draws from a lot of years of frustration and longing, because I really see it as a story about a woman's relationship with her creative impulses and dreams and trying to realize those. So it came from a deep place, and it's pretty close to my heart. But I hope my next one will become my new favorite.
Yeah, I think my favorites are Probably, and both for the same reason, actually. So Wavemaker II, which was my first book and my first novel, it just that it existed at all seemed kind of a miracle, and I was just amazed that that even came to be. And I would say, actually, this last book, The Ocean House, I feel weirdly, almost the same way about it. I really think, when I finished Wavemaker II, I thought I gave it to my husband to read, and he said, "This is a pretty good book." And I sort of felt it's a pretty good book, and I feel that way about Wavemaker II, and also about this book about the Ocean House. I think this is a pretty good book. I do.
I think so too.
Thank you.
I think there is a large consensus about that. Okay. So here's an interesting question. What do you think a writer owes, if anything, the real people upon whom they base their characters? I guess that kind of assumes that you're basing your characters on real people, but I guess in the sense that characters are kind of people that exist in this literary world. I know you talked about that some, Debra and Mary-Beth, but do you have anything to add to that?
Debra, did you want to start with that?
There's a reason that I write fiction, and I love to write fiction, and that is because I really appreciate the veils of fiction, and I use them. So I do. I'm aware when I'm treading close to real life, and in fact I teach a whole class called translating memory into fiction, and we talk a lot about using the veils and to protect privacy of anyone who you maybe have in mind a little bit when you're writing, and more importantly to protect your own privacy and your own interior a bit. So I think there's lots of things that fiction writers can do to blur the edges and the outlines, and that's what I try to do.
Yeah, I think I like the idea of veils and sort of shifts. I'll take one example. Sort of, one of my characters, probably one of my very favorite characters in the book is this little tiny girl named Una, who appears at the very end. And Una, I think, was very much inspired by someone I knew right around that age who went through not what Una experiences, but something that required a great deal of her, and I was so moved and inspired by, this little tiny, like 4-year-old, 3-year-old's huge heartedness and sort of generosity. And I sort of hoped to sort of at least honor that in Una, but the circumstances are completely different, So that sort of like open-hearted approach to her life, I hope to keep, but gave her a completely different world, or enough of a different world to sort of be,
I just want to add some about Una. We haven't really touched on the humor in Mary-Beth's work, but there's a lot of humor and a lot of great, funny lines. And one of the ones that really stuck in my head is when you were writing about Una, and you say, and it was the other Una. She's something in her class, and there are 2 Unas in the class, and that just really made me chuckle because I also know a little girl named Una.
Right.
And,
right. It's this emerging popular wonderful name, right?
Other Una.
Right.
Yeah. There are many lovely, wonderful, funny little moments throughout these stories. I just really want to point that out.
And our last question, I think this will have to be our last question for the evening. And thank you so much. You've been such great audience members. But the last question is from Monique, who says, first of all, you are such an inspiration, and wants to know what inspires you.
Oh, Monique. Thank you, Monique. Well, I have to say that one thing that inspires me, I'm often inspired, I think, by bravery, by courage. and I think that's why I love Una. I think she's a very courageous little girl. And I think the most courageous certainly someone I think of again and again in terms of, being extremely courageous with an open heart, with a loving heart, is certainly my Aunt Claire. I think of her all the time, and I have some of her glow in the dark rosary beads, which are off screen, but they're here, so that her presence is here. I think she remains a very inspiring person for me to think of. I always love when I see people sort of try to step up to a plate that just seems kind of too big for them in some way. So I think that kind of thing inspires me again and again. I think I saw that with my Skidmore students. This was too hard a world to be taking a fiction class, a fiction writing class, and yet, they did, and really beautiful. So.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And Deborah, I would love to hear your answer as well if you felt like sharing about what inspires you in your writing.
I really love leaving us on Mary-Beth's note.
Sure.
I'll just say maybe to keep the focus on her. And speaking of your aunt's rosary beads, you made me think of these beads which you gave.
Oh yes.
At McDowell, and as you see, they are always right here, reminding me maybe of that very inspiring moment for me when I met you. So.
Well, that was just so lovely. Thank you so much, both of you, for sharing and being here with us this evening. And thank you to all of our audience members out there. And I just so appreciate it. And I hope you have a great evening.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night.